with our guest presenter, Louis Mette-Travis. And I'm just delighted to have Louis with us today. I've participated in some of his workshops before and found them to be really thought-provoking. And he's got so many resources and so much knowledge. And I think it's you know, especially wonderful to be thinking about inclusion in times like these. And I'm delighted that he can join us to do this. And in fact, we had planned this originally right that weekend after the work from home order started for Fred Hutch. So we just narrowly missed having this in face-to-face. And so I'm really glad that we can have this time together. I would like to encourage you to mute your audio. This is especially important if you're coming in on a phone. I know that sometimes it's harder to do that if you're coming in on a phone, but just take a moment to check to see if you're muted. And we appreciate that. Of course, the chat will be active, and we'll be monitoring that. If you have any issues or questions along the way, please let us know. I will come back to this at the end, but I did want to share with you the process for clock hours. You need to be registered for the workshop to be able to get clock hours, and we will verify your attendance here in a moment and record that based on your registration. And I'll paste these links into the chat in just a moment too for you. Then you go to the WSTA site and pay for $20 for 2 clock hours. Our in-service is 20.17. And then send us a picture or forward receipt to sep@fredhutch.org, or you can send it to me, chowning@fredhutch.org. And then we email you a clock hour form after the proof of payment for your records. And so that seems to be working pretty well. We've done one workshop already with that system. And so we're getting a system for virtual clock hours here. And again, I'll put up the slide again at the end, and in case you have any questions. But at this point, I'm really excited to turn it over to Louis. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let him jump in.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jean. I'm going to share my screen, and I wanted to make sure that everyone knows that I am recording this workshop so that other people can view it, depending on your comfort level. If you would like me to cut out any images of you that may slip in at the beginning, please feel free to send me or Jean an email, and I'm happy to do that. Just wanting to make sure that this is as accessible as possible, and I really also appreciate your willing, I've had a little bit, I was maybe noticing I was doing a set change in the background. My sweetie is a therapist and uses our upstairs space, and I use the downstairs space in the day while I'm teaching, and we switched. So I think I'm all settled in and we should be good to go. So as Jean said, this is a presentation and workshop all about growing a gender inclusive biology curriculum. My name is Louis, and I don't work alone. I have 2 main collaborators on this project named Sam Long and River Suh, and we have a website, genderinclusivebiology.com, that hopefully we'll have some time to explore at the end of the workshop. But I would like to ask everyone, if possible, to go to this link, which is bit.ly/SEPgender. That is a case-sensitive link. All of the resources we're going to be using today are in that folder, including a copy of these slides. And this is something that you can access, share, whatever is useful for you. So I wanted to start the workshop with just an acknowledgement. As Jean mentioned, these are really, really trying times as we mourn the death of George Floyd and countless others who have died due to police brutality. And as the national conversation about equity, particularly around race and anti-Black racism, I think it's important to acknowledge that teachers are essential in the fight for Black lives, and that Black lives matter, Black students matter, Black teachers, staff, administrators, and families matter. And I wanted to include a quote here by Lilla Watson, who's an Indigenous Australian artist, activist, and teacher, which I think really has a lot to do with all equity work being interconnected together. If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. but if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. For me, as a white person, as a transgender and queer person, I both experience many privileges and also have experiences of oppression. And I think that our liberation really is bound up together. And I included some resources here connected to Teaching for Black Lives. This is a book many have seen that I highly recommend, Teaching for Black Lives, and then a few other resources that connect to recent events. So I wanted to take a moment just to name that. A little bit about me. So I have been teaching in Seattle since 2012. I taught middle school for 7 years, and I am now the high school science teacher at the Academy for Precision Learning. We're a small independent school that focuses on students on the autism spectrum and students with learning disabilities. I'm an out queer and transgender man, came out to students as queer in 2015 and trans in 2016. And you can see some of my work at fishyteaching.com. I think it's important to sort of contextualize who we are as we do this work, because all that we are doing is linked into our identity. So I want to just name a little bit about me. Our agenda for today, we'll start by talking about some of the norms for the workshop, and then we're going to do some warm-up questions and knowing who's in the room. That will be something that we will do in an interactive way, and you can use the computer or phone that you're on. If you're not able to participate, you can also watch that unfold, but just a way for us to sort of get to know who's out there and sort of what you're bringing to the workshop. We'll talk a little bit about the need for gender inclusive biology education, some ideas around like what brings us to this work and why it is important. And then we will spend a fair amount of time talking about the framework, which is a way of thinking about framing gender inclusive biology education, started by Sam Long and then built out by the project. I have built in a 5-minute break. I think it can be very important in these Zoom workshops to take a little time to stare at something that isn't a screen, stretch, get some water, and then we'll come back and do a classroom activity, which is from HHMI Biointeractive, the sex verifications in sports. Some of you may have seen this before, and we'll look at it in particular in the context of the framework for gender inclusive biology education and the ways that we could each bring this into our own classroom teaching. At the end, there should be some time for exploring resources and for some question and answer if that is desired, and then we'll have some closing reflections. That is what is ahead. Here are some norms that I try to use in spaces. And I think that norms can be a really important way of creating equity-focused spaces in our classes. These are some norms that I use with my students and also use in workshops. So the first norm is to speak to your own experience and use I statements. As we are having conversations, both in small breakout groups and perhaps as a larger group, it's important to be speaking to your own experience and not try to speak for other groups or individuals. Move forward, move back. You may have heard this as step forward, step back. Folks in disability justice community encourage thinking about movement, not just stepping, but thinking about the space that you are taking up when in discussions or with other people. And if you are a person for whom sharing is quite difficult, I actually encourage you and challenge you to try and share more during this workshop space. If you are someone for whom it is like easier for you to take up a lot of space. I'm definitely a person who can talk a lot. I'm trying to step back a little bit or move back a little bit and create space for others to share. Expecting and accepting non-closure. So during this workshop, we are not going to solve transphobia and homophobia in our schools. We are not going to have all of the answers and all of the solutions to be able to leave ready to like fix the world and make all of the bad things go away. Instead, thinking about this as one step towards becoming better educators. And, you know, I hope that each and every one of you leaves with something that is useful to you and helps you in your practice, but also expecting that we're not going to be able to fix everything all at once. Taking care of your body and heart. This is super important and perhaps a little easier in a Zoom setting. So definitely make sure that during the workshop, if you have bodily needs, if you are feeling a little overwhelmed by some of the emotional stuff that comes up, the things that we're talking about, I strongly encourage you to take breaks, to step back, to ask her what you need. And I hope that others will also follow that. And then finally, what's said here stays here, what's learned here leaves here. As we are doing some breakouts or as we do larger group discussion, people may be sharing personal stories, and while this is a recorded workshop and it will be shared with individuals, I would definitely encourage you in those small groups to be respecting the confidentiality of others and making sure that folks are comfortable sharing those experiences. I want to leave a moment, and I know that Jean encouraged y'all to keep your mics muted, but I actually am going to encourage folks to do a little bit of popcorn style sharing sometimes during the presentation. So I'm curious if you have norms that you use with your students and anything that you would add or change to this list that we're using during the workshop.
Hi, Lois. I'm Nell. I liked what you had to say. It's not listed here, but you did say it of like monitoring your own time. I also love to talk a lot. So, and maybe acknowledging that, like if someone is sharing and going on and on and on too much, like we've heard from you, thank you. Like we'd love to hear from someone else so that we can just be respectful in receiving that information as well as giving it.
Word. Thanks very much, Nell.
Mm-hmm.
One that I include, and it has to do with your move forward and move back, is to be comfortable with silence, and for people to understand that some individuals need a little bit of processing time, and it's okay to give them that processing time before they speak, and you don't have to fill that silence.
Thank you, Jamie. All right. If other things come to you as our process moves on that you'd like to add to our norms list, please let us know. For now, I'm gonna move on. So for this next activity, this is going to be something that we do interactively. So if you can please go to this link either in a tab on your computer, or you can also use your phone. I don't know if scanning a QR code on a screen actually works, but you could try it. And we are gonna start by doing a little bit of some like warm-up trivia to sort of get the juices flowing. And then we will also be doing some questions to reflect on sort of what we each bring into this workshop. Go ahead and get that going. While we're doing this, I'm gonna see if I can save my chat. Oh, I think I know how to do it. I have some. Yeah.
It says you will start the poll.
It will start the poll. Yes.
Then it will start the poll. Please stay tuned.
All right, I'm going to get this started. And again, the first piece is going to be just some trivia. Feel free to guess. It's okay if you don't know the answer. And then afterwards, we'll do some questions more about who's in the group. So here's our first question, which is, which of these animals can naturally change sex? All right. Looks like folks are here. This is good. All right, it's working. So of these animals that are listed, the one that can naturally change sex is a clownfish. There's a lot of really great examples of differences in sex development in nature, and we have a feature on our website that highlights some of those examples, and they can be really great to use with students to think about the diversity of life that's out there and what we think of as normal versus what actually reflects what's going on. All right, next question. When did the International Olympic Committee end genetic testing to determine an athlete's eligibility for female events? Go ahead and take your guesses. All right, looks like the overwhelming majority is saying 2009. Oh, a couple people going in for 1968. The correct answer is actually 1999. We're gonna be learning a little bit about the history of sex verification in sports and in the International Olympic Committee through the activity that we'll do later in the workshop. So stay tuned to learn more about that. I have learned a lot in the process of preparing for the workshop and also using that particular tool. And I think it's a really pertinent and relevant question that students are often very curious about when thinking about gender and sex. All right, next question. When did US school biology classes end the bar body staining lab exercise, which determines a student's number of X chromosomes? All right, as many of you said, it is still happening in some schools. And this is actually an activity that a number of intersex activists have really pushed to try to get out of the biology classroom. It's a really cool exercise that connects to students' personal experiences, but for some students, the bar body exercise is the first time that they discover they have intersex traits, which you can imagine as a high school biology teacher, we're not necessarily prepared to work with a kid through that process. It can also be very stigmatizing for students who know that they are intersex and don't want that information to be shared with their classmates. So definitely something to think about and something that is still happening and that there is still advocacy to do around. Right. Next question. What % of LGBTQ students saw positive representations of LGBTQ people in their science class in a 2013 report? What do you think? Sad but unsurprising that no one chose 14% because that still seems so low to me. Folks were mostly correct. 2%, about 2%, a little more than 2% reported that they had seen any positive representations of LGBTQ folks in their science class specifically. Okay, and then I think this is the last sort of warm-up question. Which of these organizations have released a statement or policy in support of equity-based and/or gender-inclusive science teaching? All right, and yes, it is indeed all of the above. NABT and NSTA and the NGSS all have made statements about gender inclusive and or equity-based science teaching. The NSTA recently updated their gender inclusive science teaching policy statement, and it is incredible. It's got a lot of teeth, and we'll look at that a little bit later. So I'm excited to dig into that. Okay. So these next 3 questions are asking about your personal experience. And this first question is asking about your personal experience in high school when you were a high school student. When you were in high school, what was the atmosphere like for LGBTQIA people? Was it actively hostile, wasn't accepted, silently hostile, maybe it wasn't accepted, but it wasn't really talked about? silently neutral, kind of don't ask, don't tell, outwardly accepting, or something else? Nice. And you'll notice I gave you the option to check more than one of those because our realities in a particular setting can be multiple things at once, right? And so as we're looking at this, it looks like we have the majority of folks, maybe not, yes, the majority of folks sort of a silently neutral, don't ask, don't tell. That's something that I think we hear about commonly, and including in the science classroom, where there might not necessarily be hostility towards LGBTQ individuals that happens there, but they aren't necessarily talked about directly. There's also some silence, but in a hostility manner, and then a couple that experience some active hostility or some outwardly accepting. That one person, happy for you. I also had a very accepting high school experience. Before that, not so much. But here's my next question. I am very curious about this one, especially for us folks working in really diverse settings. How accepting is your current workplace of LGBTQIA people? And this can be from your perspective, any number of these things. And again, this might be more than one thing at once. Word. So there's a lot of spread across the board. And in this one, I see a lot more people choosing multiple options here. The reality for those of us working in schools or working in education is that different settings are really, really different. And there can be some spaces that feel actively hostile and others that are outwardly accepting. And that is also definitely true for our students in terms of what they experience in the classroom. And so this is good for me to know as we are moving through this, sort of where folks are at. I wonder if anyone in the audience wants to share a little bit about your experiences or share a little bit about sort of what this question raises for you.
So this is Jeannie. We have in the last few years more affinity groups and more kind of visibility for folks, but we still don't have a gender neutral restroom anywhere on our campus. And that's something that I find really problematic.
Word. Physical spaces speak volumes in terms of what the priorities are of an organization and what is truly accessible. So thanks for sharing that.
So this is Christy, and we have 4 students in staff gender neutral bathrooms, yet it amazes me how, while there's huge pockets of very much acceptance, there's also huge pockets of like active hostility in the school where I teach, which is.
Word. Thank you so much for sharing. Great. I was trying to practice good wait time. I'm going to move on to the next question. And definitely the question I am most curious about for y'all coming into this workshop. How comfortable do you feel addressing transgender and intersex topics in your classroom right now? board. Thanks, folks, for sharing. Looks like we're spread around the board. No one is coming in here being like, I got this all down, which makes sense. You're here for the workshop. But I am also glad to see that either you didn't know what I meant by lost at sea, or you do have some footing, but maybe are less on the comfortable side. I hope that no matter where you are on the spectrum, that you will leave this workshop with something that you can use with your students and that will help you feel even more comfortable addressing those topics in your classroom. All right, I'm going to stop the poll. We're going to go back over to the presentation. And we're actually going to start right now by thinking about some of these key terms. So in the folder that is shared with you, and by the way, the folder link is down here if you ever lose it, there is a folder of some 101 materials. I will definitely, if there are specific resources that you're looking for that aren't there, I'm happy to add them. But as we're working through the workshop, these are 5 key terms that we will be using that I think are important to define right off the bat. One of them is gender identity, which is a personal sense of one's own gender. This is something that is self-determined and distinct from a person's sex assigned at birth. Sexual orientation is a person's attraction towards men, women, both or neither. It's distinct from gender identity, really thinking more about how a person relates to others in relationships rather than thinking about how they identify themselves. Sex assigned at birth is the determination of a newborn infant's sex as male or female, usually from inspection of external genitalia by a healthcare provider. And then we have these 2 terms down below that relate to how these words connect to each other. One is transgender, which is broadly any person whose gender identity is not fully aligned with their sex assigned at birth. It's a pretty broad term, and there's lots of different folks that fit into that umbrella. And then intersex, which is any person with sex characteristics oh, sorry about that typo, that vary from the typical patterns of male or female development. Intersex people are born with these differences or develop them in childhood. So these are just some of the key terms that we will be using. Again, this will be available as a reference, and I encourage you to explore the 101 resources if that's something that you're interested in. A couple of tools that I've used as an educator that I think can be really helpful. One is the Gender Unicorn. This was created by the Trans Student Educational Resources Trans Run group. And this is just a way of thinking about these different categories. And you can use it for yourself. I definitely don't encourage you to use this in classes where you encourage students to be writing out their own identities, because that can be very vulnerable, especially for LGBTQ students. But you can use this as a model for thinking about the differences between these different identities and working with them in the classroom. I also want to point out that these tools that are using change over time. So this is 2 versions of the gender triangle. This is an older version that I've used in workshops as recently as a month ago, which talks about gender attribution, sex assigned at birth, gender expression, gender identity, and it has been updated to be a little bit more clear and actually maybe a little simpler. So attribution is how you are perceived by others, expression is how you present yourself, body is how your body exists and changes, and then gender identity is how you see yourself on the inside. And I wanted to highlight this both as, I think, a useful tool, and also to just point out that things are constantly changing. And so there is no like one answer for what is the best tool. And I think that that's really exciting, but it can also be kind of intimidating.
Louis, you mentioned with the unicorn that you would not use that in certain contexts in the class. Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So moving back here, so this is what I wanted to say here. I think the unicorn is a really useful tool when working with students or even families when sort of working, and I also have used it in faculty trainings. One thing that comes up sometimes is that it can be tempting to use the unicorn to be like, okay, cool, go ahead and go down each of these and mark down what your gender identity is and what your gender expression is, what your sex assigned at birth was. And those are things that can be very deeply personal. And while it's like an interesting moment, and this is like a learning moment for me in a particular setting where the people who you are trying to lift up in that, which specifically like LGBTQ folks, whether like regardless of that group, actually might be most marginalized by that decision. And so instead, I would encourage, when I taught sex ed, for example, we use this and I would have sample people where I was like, you know, Ryan is a trans man who dates men and women, but also, you know, and you create examples and you can work through those examples together. rather than making it something personal. Thank you for asking that clarifying question.
That helps. And I think there was something in the chat too, but potentially using this to address gender to clarify what you mean when teaching sex chromosomes. Could you use it in that context?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when teaching about sex chromosomes, this could be a really great way to talk about the wide breadth of what that identity can look like, and focusing on how chromosomes connect to, although are not always connected to sex assigned at birth, depending on what a person's outer appearance is when they are born, their chromosomes might not necessarily be a part of that. Great clarifying question. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Jeannie. All right. So we'll talk a little bit about the need now. I'm checking my time. Okay. Okay. When thinking about making biology gender inclusive, we first often think about helping transgender and gender diverse students engage and see their identities reflected in science class. There's data out that say about 0.7 to 2.7% of students identify as transgender at the high school age. But it's also to help all students, to help them understand the complexity of the world around them, and to also increase students' ability to empathize with others and embrace many forms of diversity. So this is a study that was done in 2017 that showed when gender diversity is taught about explicitly in a science class, it actually improved students' ability to empathize with diverse gender expression, including trans people. So there's a lot of reasons to do this. And I actually wanted to play this video. This is a student animation that does a really great job explaining why inclusive curriculum is really important. So I am going to hit play.
Our world is full of brilliant detail, each one necessary for the rest of the picture to be fully appreciated. No one would dream of taking colors out of works of art. So then why do we omit essential historical facts from our history books? Lessons are being taught in our classrooms that leave enormous gaps in our understanding of how the LGBTQ community has contributed to our world. Right now, only 2 out of 10 students say they are taught positive representations of LGBTQ people, history, or events in the classroom. And while this might not seem like a big deal, you should know that 38.3% of LGBTQ students have been physically harassed at school, and 63% feel unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation. Sure, everyone has been teased at some point in life. But when less than 2% of your peers and not even 6% of your school staff are willing to stick up for you, that can have a very isolating effect. And keep in mind, this is just for students who have either realized they are gay or feel confident enough to have come out. There are so many more LGBTQ kids out there that are affected that we never hear about. So, what does that have to do with discussing positive representations of LGBTQ people? When students feel like they are understood or have something to relate to, it gives them a better sense of self-worth. By implementing LGBTQ inclusive curriculum, students, teachers, and school leaders promote respect and break down the stigmas regarding homosexuality and transgender people. In schools where GSAs have been initiated, verbal harassment has gone down by 18%. And because they improve safety, attendance rates are better, and the overall GPA is increased by 1.2 points. All of this, simply by students willing to stand up for other students. LGBTQ inclusive curriculum teaches all students about the contributions of gay and transgender Americans throughout history and the positive effects this community have on our country. The history is there. So let's start to fill in the blanks.
So this video and many others often focus on including LGBT voices, and that is something that is really important. And I think what's cool about being science teachers doing this work is that we have the opportunity to also bring in a scientific perspective to support the ways that LGBTQ identity is like valid and supported and celebrated as a part of the diversity of what exists out there. So just wanted to jump into that. In the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular checklist. It is included in the folder, and I encourage you to take a look at it and do some reflection on it yourself. But this is a tool that actually I created specifically for this workshop as a way to think about some of the ways that gender inclusion can show up in unexpected ways in the classroom and in the biology classroom in particular. So I encourage you to explore this on your own, but just thinking about and reflecting on the particular ways that each of us may have been supported or unsupported and included or unincluded in science classrooms in the past, and then how to use this list to create sort of a set of things that we are trying to create in our own classrooms as like creating an inclusive space. And if you have feedback about this, I really encourage you to also let me know. So at the end of the day, transgender and gender diverse youth are not safe or well-served in schools that don't have an inclusive curriculum. And then when we think about biology class in particular for trans and gender diverse youth, we often see 3 different patterns in science class, and this kind of harkens back to what folks were thinking about when they were thinking about their own high school experiences often. One is omission, some is alienation, and then there's also affirmation. And I'll just quickly touch on each of those. So in terms of omission, this is the sort of silent, which may be don't ask, don't tell, or silent, which may be somewhat hostile, not bringing it up within the curriculum and not really talking about it as something that is important in the context of biology teaching. So most teachers never talked about people other than cishet folks, mentioned about chromosomes as just the very basics. And when asked about these different pieces, you know, someone is mentioning they don't want to take a political stance. I mean, these are all responses taken from trans and gender nonconforming responders on a Reddit thread that my colleague Sam created. But these are things that echo a lot of what we hear from other trans folks as well. Even more troubling is alienation. So really direct and hostile actions taken towards students, thinking about the ways that particular students might be targeted either by teachers or by students, and teachers are silent about it, really overemphasizing the ways that trans and intersex people are often like created to be stigmatized or othered in some way. And really thinking about how, you know, there are many hostile environments. We're lucky as Washington educators to work in schools where theoretically the rights of LGBTQ students are protected under the law, and we should be creating those inclusive spaces. But a thing to be thinking about that is the experience of some of our students. And then shifting into what we are hoping to see more of across the board is affirmation. So emphasizing here, this is a teacher who emphasized the biological complexity of sex, really thinking about like there's a well-documented homosexuality in a variety of non-human animals. And then also really being clear about language and talking about the differences between biological sex and gender. And there are opportunities in the biology classroom to do that. And this was a quote that I also like to highlight, which is, I never really considered biology to go into topics like gender and sexuality, but it sounds really important and valuable, especially since ignorant transphobic people often spout nonsense about quote unquote basic biology without taking time to understand the differences between gender and sex. And so there are a number of examples, including legislation that is actively being passed right now where people try to use science or biology to justify bigoted beliefs. And so I personally believe as a biology teacher, I have a responsibility to be promoting accuracy in scientific resources that are available on the topic. Okay. And then, as we mentioned in that earlier piece here, in terms of the percentage of LGBTQ students in the survey who saw positive representation, history and social studies was the highest at 11.4, and then in science it was only 2.4%. So currently, trans and gender diverse students are often omitted or alienated in biology classroom. For many LGBTQ students, a career pathway in STEM is not necessarily an option. There's often lack of support from faculty, and these students are less likely to do undergraduate research. And even in the professional field of STEM, in 2015, the study found that 40% of LGBTQ professionals stay closeted, which is a really high number. But what's awesome is there are some findings that suggest that having an LGBT inclusive curriculum in science made it 17.3% more likely for an LGBT high school senior to select a STEM major when they went to college. So there's evidence that this work does have an impact, not just in students' well-being, but also in their career pathways. We also see that having supportive staff at school decreases the number of students who feel unsafe because of their sexual orientation, who feel unsafe because of their gender expression, or who miss at least one day of school because of fear of harassment or violence. So yeah, faculty and staff really do make a difference. And then we also see that this is reflected when a school has an inclusive curriculum, an LGBT inclusive curriculum, the number of students who miss school because of not feeling safe around their gender or sexual orientation decreases, which is really great. So supportive and affirming staff who create an inclusive curriculum do make a difference in students' lives. In Washington specifically, we have approximately 10,500 transgender youth. It's from the Williams Institute in 2016. And Washington has a long history of supporting the rights of LGBTQ youth. We were the first US state to protect the rights of transgender student athletes in 2007. And trans students in Washington state must be provided services affirming their gender identity in all school activities. And if you want more information about OSPI's policies supporting trans students, you can click on that link.
Do we have a sense of the numbers of LGBTQ students overall in Washington? The number?
Great question. I imagine the Williams Institute also has that data. I don't have that off the top of my head, but I imagine it is a large number.
Yeah, I imagine.
Thank you for asking. And yeah, y'all jump in. Feel free to jump in and interrupt me anytime you have a question. It is surreal to talk into the void, so I appreciate the human feedback as much as possible. You are welcome to interject. This is the NSTA recently updated statement on gender equity in science education. It is significantly longer than this, and it is awesome. If you have not read it, I really encourage you to check it out. But I wanted to highlight a couple of things from the specific recommendations given to science teachers. So they're asking science teachers to practice self-reflection about the biases they may have, to be comfortable learning from mistakes and to really take action. Really selecting curriculum materials that promote gender inclusiveness with an emphasis on historical and current inequities, and to select curriculum that promotes culturally diverse role models, including male, female, and trans individuals working at all disciplines and all levels of science. And so really, I like lifting this up both because I think it is a sign of the way things are going, and also that there are institutions supporting us doing this work, and it is important and relevant to science teaching. Similarly, NABT, so NABT is coming out with an updated statement about gender, but in 2012, this is thinking about equity specifically, and making sure that it reflects a full spectrum of human dimensions and that diversity contributes to the richness of biological science. So at the end of the day, you've got institutional clout to support you when doing this work with your students and school community. All right, now we get to do a little bit more breakout, less of me talking, which I'm like very much looking forward to. This is a list of the 5 guiding principles for like gender inclusion in the biology classroom that again was put together by my colleague Sam. This is also included in the principles handout, which is in the shared folder, which you can check out as you see fit. But the 5 principles that we're going to be looking at today are going to be authenticity, continuity, affirmation, anti-oppression, and student agency. And what we will do is I'm going to be breaking the group into 5 breakout rooms. And in those breakout rooms, I'm going to have you look through an example that specifically focuses on one of these topics. So breakout room 1 will look at the example that is specifically about authenticity, which is example 1. Breakout room 2 will look at continuity, and so on and so forth. In those examples, you will have sort of a real life case study with some names changed that focuses on one of these topics as it relates to the biology classroom. and then talk through some of the questions on that worksheet as a group in terms of what's happening in the scenario, what are teachers doing, how could teachers improve it, sort of reflecting on how that connects back to creating a stronger classroom practice. I'm going to give y'all about 10 minutes to read and discuss your case, and then we will come back together and you'll have 4 minutes to share that out with the group. So these examples are linked to in this slide. This is slide 36. They are also in the folder itself. I believe they are document number 3. It says gender inclusive, like the framework scenarios. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you a minute to like find this. It's also going to give me a minute to make the breakout groups. And then you are going to split out into breakout groups. I'll come and visit your breakout rooms as you are discussing it, but it would be really helpful if one person in each breakout room, as you are working on this, can take some notes on what you discuss so that it can be shared with the group later. Okay? So what we're going to do right now, I heard some really cool conversations. It was like a little awkward popping in and out of rooms. It's not quite like leaning over your shoulder and listening to your conversation, but hopefully folks had a chance to identify 1 or 2 folks who will share from each of your groups. And I will give those groups the opportunity to share their screen if they would like to. And it's also okay if you just want to share the things that you talked about. So let's start with group 1, who was doing an example about sex chromosomes and authenticity.
So it was basically like a teacher who taught her class about sex chromosomes, the XX and the XY, and she nervously mentions, this is what it says, that it's not as simple as XX for girls and XY for boys, and looks directly at one of the transgender students while doing so, and then she just moves on awkwardly and then never comes back to it again. And so we were tasked with looking at authenticity, and you can see on the Word document what impressions did this teacher leave on the students, that gender is really basic, and that she's very uncomfortable and doesn't have more knowledge to be able to go more in depth into other topics. What impression did that teacher leave on transgender students? Probably makes them feel a little odd and uncomfortable, and that being transgender made people uncomfortable. I would imagine that student probably also felt like they've been outed if they weren't already. What decisions did the teacher make? They decided not to learn more, not to ask students for help or input. Like even in that moment when you're feeling stuck and not realizing like, oh crap, I should have done more, like to recognize that students might be able to add to this conversation right now in a productive way. And not, one of the ideas of authenticity is encouraging kids to question things that they already know. And so just putting it out there of like, what do you think? Is that it? Is that all there is to it? And hopefully kids would come up with something. How authentic? Not very, just felt awkward. And then we thought of ways to improve the situation before it happens would be doing more research, asking for advice and help potentially from other teachers or students, just to become more educated, trying to possibly prep students ahead of time and think of questions that they could ask during that situation to kind of keep that conversation going. This is also a good moment to clarify sex versus gender before you start talking about the sex chromosomes. And then once it's already happened, if it's too late, asking students to kind of add those questions in and question their assumptions. I like that wording of question their assumptions. Asking them if they still have questions, and also potentially an exit ticket if they're not comfortable sharing out those questions out loud. And if a teacher doesn't have experience for this, where can they go for help and what can they do? Talking to other teachers. Someone also brought up our district leadership should, in theory, be a good resource for us. And so even if they're not, getting them kind of on board with all of this is going to have a really good trickle-down effect. And seeking out that scientific evidence to help them support these ideas in their classes and kind of keep it factual and avoid the politics, and just like make it a little more concrete that kids don't feel like they can argue with it in a way that becomes political. It's like, no, we're just dealing with the science of it. And then someone else also brought up if there's a club on campus, to talk to the advisor or the members of the club to get a little advice from them. And that's it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Team One. I think that, you know, as teachers, we always end up in situations where we do something where we want to like stick our foot in our mouth. And I really like that you emphasize the need for really strong leadership. And I think this teacher and other teachers, as you encounter things that you aren't familiar with, it's important for us to also acknowledge that our leadership admin, like, to step up and really provide training for everyone. It shouldn't be something that's our responsibility as teachers to have to seek out. Like, this is something that we all are involved in. So thank you so much. Next up is Team Two, thinking about intersex traits and continuity.
I'm Becca. I'm gonna do that one. I'm just gonna make sure that I'm sharing the right thing. Okay, so these are the notes that we took on continuity. So our scenario was basically, I think the wording of it is actually really important. So I'm gonna go to that. That the teacher said, oh yeah, I've heard of intersex diseases, that these healthy eggs and sperm, these to us were the, you know, big standouts about this. And then kids asked, can transgender people still make eggs and sperm? And then class ended, and then he was gone the next day and showed a documentary on gender revolution and never discussed it again. So that's the context. So what impressions might the teacher leave on students on transgendered? We just said, when you're discussing differences as diseases, when you're saying that people are not healthy, this message goes to the kids, I'm not healthy, I'm not normal, I'm a disease. And absolutely kids internalizing that in all the negative ways. What decision did the teacher make? Teacher pushed it off on a sub to try to do it, didn't continue the conversation, made it a one-off discussion, a standalone lesson, like a special situation. Can you tell we were frustrated by this example? What are some ways you could improve the situation beforehand, afterwards? Be upfront about, I don't know. Like if you are someone who is ignorant about this topic, say, you know, I don't know, let me find out about that. Start with a diversity lens, always looking at things of like, it's not just male, it's not just female, there's this entire spectrum of how this works, and be open with the possibilities of how very different sex and gender is, maybe talking about sex and gender and all the differences that exist in chromosomes, and that differences are healthy. Evolution. If a teacher doesn't have experience with this, where can they go? We mentioned website, asking colleagues, saying that you don't know, asking, maybe seeking a student if you're comfortable with them, but watching out for fatigue of always going to the same students. So yeah.
Thanks, Team Two. That was great. Next up is Team Three, talking about affirmation through the lens of sexual selection.
Renee, I think you're muted.
Thanks. Yeah, I was like, if you're talking, I can't hear you.
I was muted. Okay, so the first part was about, there were two parts to ours. And the first part was looking at like a traditional way you might think about sexual selection, and especially that kind of reifies gender ideas and like stuff in our society, but the thing like the alpha male is the one who wins and like the one who passes on his genes and everybody else doesn't. And that mating is like for the greater good of the species, and there's a lot of like these kind of things. And then when there was a second part that gave a lot of examples of like that go against those, and I think the important part there is that that these are all things that happen in nature, because like what happens is people will say things like, this is not natural, like and they use really terrible terms. And so like they talked about, you for people who are born intersex, you could use the hyena example. Bonobos versus chimps are really different in how they've developed as a society, and one seems more like the traditional example of like the alpha male that we use is the chimpanzees, but the bonobos deal with stuff very differently. And you could talk about sexual selection too with swans. The male partner swans raise their cygnets more successfully than the male female partner swans. And then talking about that that just like helping kids realize that there's a really huge diversity of even the idea of sexual selection throughout the animal kingdom, and that even this idea of well, if you can't have a biological child, you're not contributing to the species is not even true. So let's see, how do I unshare? Stop share.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of really great resources that have been put together by my colleague River on the website genderinclusivebiology.com. They gathered a lot of resources specifically about differences in the ways that sex and quote unquote gender roles are the ways that sexual selection operates in different species that are different from the norm. One of the things that I do want to name that can be tricky with animal examples, and we run into this often in workshops, is that animals and humans have a lot of things in common, and we're really different. And so really making sure that, I don't know, just like naming that dichotomy that both and. I hope that that's relatively clear. Team 4, let's go. Genetic inheritance through the lens of anti-impression.
Haley, now you're muted.
Yeah, it moved in the screen. Sorry, guys. So we looked at sex-linked traits and how they are passed along to biological children with a little diagram and an article or a blurb. So we talked about family structures and what are present and absent. It only talks about biological mother and father. We talked about changing that to sperm and egg donor, and then including all the other types of family structures that are present, which happens later on. Then the passage assumes that females always have 2 X chromosomes and males always have XY chromosomes. It doesn't give any room for difference. So that's how the chromosomes are related to mother and father. And the only things that they can pass along is X for females and then Y or X for males, which is not always the case. And it does use the words always. So some assumptions based on the language and visuals are that always females are one way and males are another, which also is not the case, and that promote harmful assumptions. Then we looked at a diagram based on genetic inheritance, which seemed a little more gender inclusive or sex inclusive in this paragraph or this part. The languages here are better. So it says typically women, typically men, so there is room for variation within that. We talked a little bit about how that could even be taken out and just said like there are exceptions to this, especially with like the 46 chromosomes. That's not always the case. Other messages that there were, that's about it for that. For the image, we really liked that the female and the male are the exact same except for their inner organs being the ovaries and the testes. And that there is no representation of like a mom and a dad, so they don't have to relate back to that, which leads us into our next diagram, which related back to different family structures. So families that could also be included, we thought about grandparents, raising kids, aunts or uncles, students being raised by siblings or families with surrogate moms or dads. I guess just mom. And then other language, again, this doesn't include like biological mom or dad. And then we thought again about sperm and egg donor as a language that may or may not be used in the context.
Well, thanks for sharing out about that. One of the great things universally is that, as far as I know, every person that has ever been born started as a sperm and an egg that came together. And so that is very universal language. And it's always like fun to dig into what kinds of universal language can be used and the ways that that anti-oppression lens can be. Sean, for 5, come on down.
Did you call for group 5 and I missed it?
Yeah, I did it really quietly. Sorry. Group 5, come on down.
And I'm massively like, what screen am I on?
Absolutely.
Okay. And these are my notes. So this is like,
Joan, you hit the mute button there. You hit the mute button when you showed us your notebook, so you have to unmute again. Sorry, hon.
all right, can you hear me? So I was trying to share the screen that just shows what we were looking at, but our task was task 5, which was student agency and looking at ways of including and engaging students in the process of creating both the culture and the curriculum of the classroom, which we, thank you, that's exactly what I was looking for. Which we all agreed clearly has some great benefits. It's affirming to students, it's relevant to the students, it's engaging, it makes them as co-creators of what you're on about in the classroom. There are a lot of challenges in doing this, and so we talked about a number of challenges, and then I think we can come back to there are many different ways of doing this. There's the challenge of kind of throwing it out to the whole class, as far as if you throw out a large question to a class, you're going to hear an awful lot of answers back, and so it's hard to accommodate everybody's wishes, because clearly somebody's views are not going to be represented if you are soliciting everybody's views, and so somebody will always be left out. And the idea came out, especially if it's a majority sort of thing, that if you have students who are marginalized and almost by definition the minority of students in the class, if you offer something out as a large group process and the majority wins, then those students are going to continue to be marginalized along the way. So you need to be really careful about not letting that happen, sort of the tyranny of the masses. We talked about how also in doing it in a large group sort of situation, which might be the number 4 classroom assessment tool, where you just throw it out to the class. You could be getting information back from students who have, uneducated views that they are hearing at home that they're parroting back. And so it's being able to nip that in the bud to actually highlight some views and sort of downplay other views is a tricky thing to do in the classroom as a teacher. There are other ways of doing this, letting students choose their own projects to work on, letting students choose their own things that they want to create individually. We also talked about the difference between anonymous and non-anonymous sorts of feedback, that they both also have their challenges and their benefits. Somebody else from the group want to jump in?
I think that was good, Joan.
Thanks, Team 5. Team 5 always ends up with the most challenging conversations in some ways because they're the most nebulous, but also some of the most crucial in terms of thinking about how do we make sure that our students are reflected in the work that we're doing while also holding a space that is safer than just a, nightmare Lord of the Flies scenario. So
the last question was super deep. We just had gotten started on that one when we got.
Yeah, and then I'll read it out loud for the group. How can we navigate protecting vulnerable students, trans and intersex students, students with disabilities or genetic diseases, students of color, and others from needing to speak for their communities while centering their experiences in the room? I think that that's a big thing that we, as educators who are dedicated to equity, have to hold, especially when we don't share the identity of the folks who are most centered in that story. So, word, that is kind of an ongoing piece.
There's an important question, I think, in the chat here. Julia was wondering if the term biological gender, biological female or biological male is considered a suitable replacement for gender assigned at birth to add some flexibility to speaking about these topics. So how would you best frame that?
That's a great question. When we're talking about bodies, my recommendation is to think about what it is that you're talking about in that context. So we often don't talk about biological gender. Gender, we're often talking about identity. So we would talk about biological sex and gender identity separately. But even when talking about biological sex, it's something that as the next activity that we have less and less time for, which is fine, talks about the idea that biological gender or sex is something that is really concrete. It's actually a long list of things, including chromosomes, genitals, hormones that are being produced, hormones that are being, that we have receptors for that are actually changing the body. And so my recommendation to teachers in general is when you're talking about something that connects to sex or gender, talk about get as specific as you can. So if you're talking about cervical cancer, I wouldn't talk about women, I would talk about people with cervixes, because there are many cis women who don't have a cervix because it's been removed. Or there are, men with a cervix, or, and on and on. And I also think that, especially for me as a trans person, the idea of biological sex is really hazy, because I have the sex that I was assigned at birth, and I have my gender identity, and there's my body has changed over time compared to what it would have if there hadn't been particular things that happened to it. And so I guess that my advice is try to be clear about what it is that you're talking about, and when talking about bodies in general, we use the term sex. I hope that answered your question, Julia. Word.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Jeannie, I wanted to check in with you. Is 4:45 my target?
No, you can go over. We have some flexibility. So if you wanted, to do the stretch break or whatever, we could do that. Or
I think I would like for everyone to just take a 1 minute stretch break.
Yeah.
Look away from the screen. I'll see you in 30 seconds. Yeah. Sometimes as a teacher, you can forget you have a body because you're expected to sit or stand or whatever for so long. So,
Louis, could I ask you a question during the break?
Absolutely.
So I teach at a community college, and I teach molecular biology research. And so I guess the strategy that I'm interested in is to highlight more gender diverse, the work of more gender diverse scientists in my class. But the kind of hurdle that I find is, how do I do that without saying, look, it's a gender diverse scientist, right? If you're trying to highlight people of color, you don't have to say anything, because if you put a picture of them up there, it's obvious. But it's not obvious when talking about gender diversity. So do you have any advice for me as far as sharing work from a gender diverse scientist and letting my students know that they're gender diverse, but without making it sound like, ooh, so unique and, potentially strange or whatever?
Yeah, I think in the same way that when I share the stories of female scientists or scientists of color, I don't necessarily start with their identity. I think I would start with what that scientist had done and just be like Ben Bars, for example, is a famous example of a transgender biologist and doctor. And he, when talking about him with students, I'd be like, talk about what that person did first and then be like, also, they were the first transgender blank or whatever. And it doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to be the central piece of that, but it can still be reflected in the way that you talk about that person. That would be general advice. And there may be other advice in the audience. And Tim just asked, isn't part of it normalizing the behaviors? Tim, can you clarify your question?
It's not really a question. It's more of if we only expect LGBTQ peoples to put pronouns after their names and their signature lines, then you're basically outing somebody who puts their pronouns in the signature line of their emails. And so I would assume that if it's the same thing, if we're going to say this is a black scientist, that we would say this is a white scientist, so that it's kind of normalized. If this is a lesbian scientist, well, this is a heterosexual scientist. So it's kind of normalizing the whole thing that that's was kind of my response to the question that I think Jan asked.
Word. And I think naming those things as a practice can be helpful in naming the things that are considered quote unquote normal, right? If I only point out that a person has gender diversity when they're trans and, or whatever, then it's like assuming that transness is somehow othered. And I also, want to note that I do think that there is power in naming the marginalized identities of folks in STEM who come from those backgrounds because of the ways that folks have been marginalized and their voices aren't always centered. So it's both. So thank you for raising that. I appreciate that. Folks ready to dive back in? Thanks for taking a screen break. I appreciate it. And we're going to be back here. So given that we have a shorter amount of time left than would be appropriate for all of the things, I think that what I'm going to do is I am going to offer you different options. One thing, I'm going to just show you the activity that I was going to have folks work on together. And one of the options can be working on that particular activity and going through the first piece of that. Another option will be exploring some resources, including I would really love for folks to explore the resources at genderinclusivebiology.com. And we are always looking for feedback and for things that you want as resources as educators so that we can be useful for you. And then also it can be an opportunity for folks to do more like a Q&A. And if you want to ask questions, we can be doing that at the same time. So those are going to be the three options. And I'm actually going to, because I'm very, very visual, I will put that on a slide at the end here. Bam. Okay. If I hit present, can you still see this? Great, awesome. So this classroom activity is one that I wanted to highlight. Someone mentioned that they had done it themselves and learned a lot from it, which is really cool. And actually, this is also an awesome opportunity, I think, to learn more about sex and like the biology of sex in general. It's a really dense, like many HHMI resources, very dense and very, very rigorous. But it's a relevant and timely topic. I often find that when I first bring up gender in the classroom, gender and sex, one of the first things that kids want to talk about is sex verification in sports and who should be allowed to compete as a female person in the Olympics or other kinds of competitive sports. There are also current laws that, like a law was recently passed in the state of Idaho in January. A academic lawmaker tried to make it so that trans girls could not compete in women's sports in high school in Washington state. So there's like a lot of reasons why this just like comes up and is very relevant. And this is a really excellent, well-respected resource that shows the reasons why it is more complex than just like, oh, well, there's these, it is like a complex topic, thinking about sex and sex verification. The activity itself is rooted in science, but is connected to gender inclusiveness, social justice. And it is also something that is online, so it is something that can be delivered remotely that all of us who are currently teaching are thinking about all the time. One thing to note is that before beginning the activity, students need to be somewhat familiar with meiosis and gamete production, genes and gene expression, and then also, I think it says down here, cell receptors. I have so many things in front of my screen that I can't see hardly anything. Yeah, cell receptors. And so those would be things, if I was going to use this in the classroom, that I would want to make sure that we at least touched on before starting, and hopefully would have a little bit more of meaty background on. And so this is one option that you have. I think it's a really cool thing to explore. There is also a student worksheet that is included in the folder that you can do. Oh, this is the connections to NDSS and other curricular connections. If you are like an AP Environmental Science or AP Biology teacher, IB Biology, there's connections there. And then you are certainly welcome to use the student worksheet if that is something that's helpful for you. But I also just encourage folks to look through the introduction and human development sections, because there's really excellent information and it's organized in a way that's pretty accessible. So that is one option that you have. Another option is to look at genderinclusivebiology.com. So we have a number of resources up there, and there are also some specific resources tucked in here that you can explore if you are interested in those specifically. And then also, if you want to stick around and do a little bit of Q&A, if that is what is most useful for you, or you have a burning question, I am also happy to like be here and be answering questions in this group as folks are exploring those resources. So it is currently 4:43. I am going to set aside 7 minutes to do this, so we end at 4:50, 4:51, and then hopefully Jean will have some time to do the WSTA stuff at the very end. Does that sound good?
Yeah, are we building in a little bit of time for folks to give some feedback about what they found? Because I think it's fine if I have 5 minutes at the end.
5 minutes, okay, great. Yes, then yes, there'll be 5 minutes for some share outs and like a little bit of like.
Yeah,
we'll
sounds good. Let's do this.
All right. So go ahead and explore the thing that you would like to explore. And if you have questions, feel free to pop them into chat or chat out loud. All right, I know that that is certainly not enough time. But as we are preparing here, I got a couple of questions in the chat. One is, are you working on a resource of gender diverse scientists and STEM professionals? We are not working on that. There is a group called Project Biodiversify who is working on collecting the stories and voices of gender diverse scientists and STEM professionals, and it's a great recommendation so that we get that up on the website, because that's something that a lot of folks ask about, so thank you. The science etymology is so good. Great, I'm glad you like that. Sam Long is a dreamboat. I love working with him and he's brilliant, so I'm glad that that's useful to you. I'm going to share this up real quick.
So that is in the Gender Inclusive Biology site. Science
it's on the site, and it's also linked to in the slides. I can find it.
So I feel like that is a big part of the struggle, is the language, especially around, I didn't get quite as hung up talking about gender as I do sometimes about biological sex, right? Like this just seems very challenging.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, the etymology, the goal of it is to show the ways that there are common root stems in words that are used by the LGBTQ community and by scientists, which is really cool because there's like really a lot of really great connections, and it gives kids an opportunity to learn more about both at the same time. In terms of thinking about talking about sex, I think that is something that everyone struggles with. We were recently working on an article for NSTA and trying to talk about sex, and like would get into fights about it as like 3 people who are doing this work. And it's hard, it's complicated. We're gonna mess up. And if that is a resource that would be useful, that is really helpful feedback. I wanted to give folks a chance to do a quick share out, and I know that we are super down to the wire, but if there are some folks who want to share one thing that you'll be taking away from this workshop, I'm gonna just leave it open so folks can share out a little bit before we close.
Lots of great resources.
Yeah, for me, it's the resources and knowing where to go and find some better language to use.
There's an interesting brochure from kind of intersex students as an example of kind of what they wanted and needed, and learned some things there about how they felt about the use of the word hermaphrodite, for example, which, you know, comes up in biology quite a bit if you're talking about like C. elegans or something. But, you know, for students to be aware that that's, you know, that kind of language might be really alienating. There's a nice article on the site too about teaching genetics in a gender inclusive way, which I think a lot of teachers here might be also interested in.
For me, it was awareness of referring to certain terms when you're talking about like sex chromosomes, and staying away from the term mother and father and trying to use something more like egg or sperm donor. And that was an aha moment for me. Appreciate that.
I thought it was so helpful, and I would love an opportunity for a part 2 of this. Not necessarily with more information, but, you know, a time to really think more deeply about developing habits of speaking with students and developing habits of evaluating materials that we give, you know, that we present in our classroom. So I really appreciate the session.
Thanks, y'all. There's also some great contributions in the chat. I have really deep appreciation for all of you for being here, especially teachers. I know that you had a really long day, I had a really long day, and I love sharing the space with you because the work that you're doing is really important, and it's really valuable to know that we're not alone in this work. So I really appreciate sharing this space with you today, and remember that the work that you do with students really makes a difference now more than ever. I have a friend who reminds me all the time, he's like, Lewis, you're doing a great job. I'm like, you don't know. And I was like, no, you do. Like, we're working hard, and it's really can be very discouraging, but every step we take really does matter. So thank you for the immense effort you've been putting into that. And thanks for being here today. I'm going to hand it over back to Jeannie.
Yeah, and if you all want to unmute for a second and give Lewis a big round of applause and thank you. Yay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's, you know, it is scary.
Good job.
It's definitely scary going into, you know, trying to talk in a different way than we might be used to. But, you know, this kind of attempt at doing something new that's important, I think is like a step forward for so many of us. Certainly I've gained a lot from thinking about the ways that I use language around some of these topics.